On this week's Live with Littlewood, new IEA research finds that socialism isn't just a phase. If anything, the young are growing into it. How do free marketeers regain ground in the battle of ideas? And while young people might say they want a socialist economy, aren't they more fussed by the culture wars? Or is wokery and control over what we can say and how and where we can say it the real issue that should trouble us? A stellar lineup of guests will be discussing all that and more in this week's Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to another episode of Live with Littlewood. Thank you for joining me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, for a free market look at the big issues of the week. Coming up on this week's show, can free speech survive in this apparently and increasingly censorious time? I'll be putting the question to the editor of a recent IEA book titled Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century. But first, polling conducted by Forefront Market Research and released by the IEA this week indicates that not only are young people still attracted to socialism, but this is not mere youthful dalliance. It's lasting well beyond their university years and into their 30s and 40s. Will supporters of free markets sit up and take notice? What can we do about it? To discuss these issues and more, I'm delighted to be joined from the home team. A warm welcome back to the programme by Dr. Kristian Niemietz, Head of Political Economy here at the IEA. Good evening, Kristian. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
And a warm welcome back to the show to William Clouston, leader of the Social Democratic Party. Good evening to you, William. How are you doing? Can't hear William. He's on mute. He's off mute. Good. How are you, William?
Very well, thanks. Yes, good.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Mark.
And now loud and crystal clear as well. Perfect. Lovely to have the two of you with us. Kristian, let me start with you. I think the report and the polling showed that 67% of young people say they would prefer to live in a socialist economy. Just talk us through initially what some of these market research findings were, exactly how monumentally popular was socialism and amongst whom?
Sure. So the purpose of this polling was not to find out whether young people are keen supporters of free markets and free enterprise. I started from the presumption that almost none of them are. We know that young people are generally more left-leaning. That's not big news. That's not a surprise. That would not have been a story. What I wanted to know is, are they just generically more left-wing? Are they just left-wing in the sense of being pro-tax and spend? Or do they endorse the sort of knee-jerk anti-capitalist views that would be popular on Twitter, the sort of blaming capitalism for every bad thing that happens in the world? And we put some propositions such as, do you agree with the idea that capitalism is responsible for climate change, or that capitalism fuels racism, that capitalism is to blame for Britain's housing crisis and things like that? And we always get very, very high levels of approval. It's across the board between 70 and 80% of respondents agree with those sort of statements.
Agree that capitalism is to blame, just to be clear.
Yes, exactly right, yes. Although we also have control questions with pro-capitalist statements on the same subjects. And what often happens is that we get majority approval for the anti-capitalist statement, but then also majority approval for the pro-capitalist statement. So it's not that the country is full of committed young Marxist-Leninists and that we're on the brink of a socialist revolution here. It's more a kind of confused knee-jerk socialism, but I think if people had to choose between the pro-capitalist and the anti-capitalist statement, the anti-capitalist one would always win hands down. You always get much higher rates of levels of approval, and it's more strongly felt. You get more people saying, I don't just agree, I agree strongly with this.
And Kristian, before I bring William in for a kind of social democratic take, what were the age profiles that we were looking at here? Is this general across the population? Is it particularly marked amongst under 25s, but still there between 25 and 35? What was the rough breakdown on demographics? Did anything stand out? I don't know. Are all men socialists, but women not so much? Or is this sort of true of all under 40s for sake of argument?
Yes, in this case, the age range was 16 to mid 30s, but I'm also talking about some earlier similar surveys where they have where they go higher, where they look at people including in their early 40s or some that cover the entire population. And the general pattern is that socialist ideas are popular among people until well into their 40s. So it's not just teenagers, and that's why this idea that this is just a phase and that people will grow out of it is completely wrong, because it is still at least as prevalent among people in their early 40s. If there was some opinion that was very common among 20-year-olds, but rare among 30-year-olds, then I would say, yes, of course, that's an effect of age. And presumably these 20-year-olds in 10 years' time, they will think like today's 30-year-olds. But if you had an opinion that was common among, say, 60-year-olds, but rare among 70-year-olds, then of course you would not say, oh, I'm sure those 60-year-olds will grow out of it. They just don't have the life experience of the 70-year-olds. No, then you would say this is a permanent difference between these age groups. And I think that's what this is.
William, let me come to you. We say this is a free market show, but we like to bring in friends and intelligent guests of different views. You're the leader of the Social Democratic Party. I guess I could summarize that by saying a supporter of the mixed economy, markets in operation, but also the state as an actor in the economy too. I think you've had the chance to read this market research. What did you make of it? Is it good news for Social Democrats, even if it's bad news for free market liberals?
I think it's probably is good news for Social Democrats, because I think some of the causes of the antipathy towards capitalism has been caused by sort of 20 or 30 years of the balance not quite being right in terms of what the state does and the market does. But I also think it's interesting that the report starts off by talking about woke attitudes among young people. And I think to some extent the attitudes that the surveys show are just a sort of a good snapshot. It's sort of interlinked with late stage liberalism and a crisis of expectations among the young, I think. So if you look at the particular problems that I think are causing these attitudinal shifts, I think obviously the housing market's been well discussed on the media the last few days in relation to the report. That's certainly there front and center. I mean, it's very difficult for you to, don't be surprised that young people find it difficult to buy into a system which basically is denying them the ability to find a house and raise a family. I mean, it's not in rocket science. I would argue that a state that fails to do that is just failing in the basics. You might think also, people are striving basically for a stable and secure life, and I'm not sure that we're delivering that. So, I mean, there are particular arguments we can have about the utilities and about the railways and so on, and we're on the state side there. I think the solution to a lot of these things is getting the frontier right between what the state does and the market does. We, as Social Democrats, we have no problem with the proposition that an open free market system is the best for delivering general goods and services. Of course it is. And I think to some extent defined, if 2/3 of young people are saying they want state socialism, then I think we're dealing with an education problem.
Well, that's quite the point. But William, let me peel away some of this. It's interesting that you say we haven't got perhaps the balance right between the market side of the economy and the state side of the economy. Wherever you think the balance should be, and I've got no doubt that Kristian and I would want a much smaller state than you would countenance. But my impression, my observation has been that in the last 10, 20 years, the state has got bigger. Taxes are now at their highest since Clem Attlee was Prime Minister. The proportion of spending as a proportion of GDP, which is, I guess, a good rough and ready way of measuring it, is pretty damned high. The number of state regulations, I mean, it might be we've privatized a large number of industries, but regulation is, you could almost argue in some areas, sort of denationalization by another, nationalization, renationalization by another means. And on housing that you particularly mentioned, William, I mean, we would be at one with you on that. That's not obvious to me that's a failure of capitalism. That's a failure of our planning laws, a state failure, isn't it?
Well, no, there's a lot in there, Mark. So let's look at housing, try and nail that a little. I've read so many reports from think tanks and SW1 trying to address the issues of housing, and you've got Liam Halligan's excellent book and so on. A lot of people are looking at it. And what's astonishing about it is astonishing about the commentary is that most of us agree there's a supply side issue here, but very few people agree that the answer to the question involves the public sector on the supply side to some extent. And I would argue that it's a basic thing. I mean, in 1979, when Mrs. Thatcher got in, 42% of the public lived in council housing. We're down to about 8% now. So as a sector, the public sector involvement in the procurement, the building and maintenance and management of public sector housing is diminished. Now, I would say don't be surprised if that has an effect. If you take off a major part of what's on the table in housing and also the state's ability to intervene where it needs to, don't be surprised that private sector operators land bank and don't produce the results you want to. I mean, housing, the sad thing about this is, in relation to the attitudinal surveys, is that I'm afraid this can't be corrected very quickly. So I think Kristian's report, if there's a gloomy side to it, I'm afraid we're stuck with a generation, probably, that buy out of support for capitalism in some respects because they don't have a stake in it. And don't be surprised, why should they support it if they don't have a stake in it? So I would, and again, I'll just lob this in, because our solution to these issues is to respect the frontiers and boundaries between what the state and the market should do. And I would say the exemplar in this is Singapore. It's funny how many free marketeers trumpet Singapore, but have a look at Singapore's, I mean, I know it's particular city-state, particular high-density place, but state involvement in the housing sector there is colossal. About 80% of Singaporeans live in public sector housing. Ditto on public transport and some utilities. So that's probably the most successful state in the world, and it runs on a social market basis. So I mean, I think the correction is in this. A lot of it will take time, but it doesn't necessarily mean a massively larger state. I don't want a huge state. I think 42% of GDP is about right. You start getting much higher than that, and I would argue probably not a free society. So it's not a case of bare size of the state. It's actually what the state does. There's quite a lot the state is doing that it shouldn't be doing. There's quite a lot that it should.
Yep. Kristian, let me bring you back in. It might be that there's going to be an outbreak of considerable agreement between a British Social Democrat, William, and a German free market liberal, yourself, on some of the merits of Singapore. It might be that you're looking at different aspects of it. But Kristian, let me put to you, do you think that when these people were blaming capitalism, in effect, they were using capitalism to mean the status quo, right? And you and I would argue that the economy isn't capitalist enough, but we'd argue that there's an awful lot wrong with the status quo, right? We're not supporters of the prevailing economic and legal arrangements. Is that the way you saw it, do you think? And do you agree with William that, although I've always hated the term stakeholder society, that in fact, if you haven't got a stake in society in some way, whether that's ability to get on the housing ladder being an obvious one, but it might also mean a portfolio of stocks and shares or that sort of thing, then obviously you're going to be disillusioned with the status quo. So are they railing against the status quo, or are they railing against the IEA?
Well, there's probably only one way to find out. We would have to have a major liberalization of the housing market, bring housing costs down, and see what happens to attitudes, whether this socialism phenomenon goes away or whether it stays. If it's the latter, then you could say, well, it's more than just the economics. It is a proper ideological commitment. If it's the former, if cheaper housing reconciles people with capitalism, then you could say in hindsight, okay, it was probably only about that. But the trouble is you can't disentangle these two factors, because people express their frustration with whatever it is, whether it's capitalism in general or whether it really is just the housing market. Either way, they express it in the same way, which is by lashing out against capitalism in general. And I don't want to necessarily put words into people's mouth, and I don't want to get into the second guessing of what they might have meant by that. But it's certainly the most common response that I'm getting so far to the report. The most common response so far has been, well, why should I be a capitalist? I pay through the nose for the shoebox in which I live. Capitalism isn't working for me, which of course for a free marketeer is of course frustrating that people make that connection, because you would think that it's fairly obvious. If high housing costs were a market failure, you would have to see the problem across the developed world. This would have to be a problem all over Europe, all over North America. It's not as if they all only had state housing. If this were a market failure, it would be a universal problem, and it isn't. Britain is always the outlier on any measure of housing costs, whether that's house prices, whether that's rent indices. It's always Britain and maybe 2 or 3 others that are the outliers here. And that's why it should be obvious that this isn't a market failure. This isn't me saying I'm comparing the status quo to some libertarian utopia. I'm just saying if we had a housing market that worked like in an average OECD country, more or less okay, I would already be happy.
William, before I bring in our 2 guests, let me bring you back in. I have a perennial refrain, or I was delighted that Kristian looked through all the market research and released it, that it can only tell you so much, because, and I would say this as a kind of Hayekian liberal, wouldn't I? There's a big difference between revealed preferences and stated preferences. If 67% of people really do want to live in a socialist country, it's hard to explain why, accepting that there are restrictions at the moment on air travel, people aren't flocking from Heathrow to Pyongyang to relocate and live in a socialist utopia. They aren't. So they sort of say this thing in opinion polls, but when it comes to a revealed preference, seems to be rather different. Don't you think that might be the case, William? And the problem I think we've got on our free market liberal side of the argument is all polls show that people want the state to do more, that taxes, people tend to want answer polls by saying taxes should go up to spend more on health or whatever. But when it's actually, when you test people's revealed preferences, they tend to be more in a free market liberal direction.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And skimming through the report and looking at the data, there are lots of instances of internal incoherence in the answers. You know, you just can't combine some of the answers. I think partly it's, as I say, a problem of education. I think it's very difficult to define it, actually. I don't think people, I would suspect many of the people answering the question don't have a clear grasp on what model of state socialism we're talking about. I've no idea, you know, that it would imply basically bread queues and the rest of it. So I think that is an issue, and I think probably I think in the conclusion of the report, when you say it's a fairly thin preference, I think that's probably right. I don't think they really mean it. I think it's, as I said before, I think it's very interlinked with a general sort of crisis of expectations that you get when you overeducate half the population and undertrain them. And I think it's probably combined with a lot of other things like deindustrialization and everything else. So I think it's just a snapshot of where we are. I take some of the particulars very, very seriously. I think I think Kristian is quite right. Britain has very particular circumstances in housing. What we need to say about that, again, without going back to it in too much detail, is that we combine very, very high immigration, gross migration of sort of 750,000 in many years, with low levels of housing completions, into sort of 350, and it's not good enough. You have that combination. It's about the worst combination you can have, and actually our duopoly, our political duopoly, offer exactly the wrong combination, we would argue. You've got the Tories that would want slightly lower immigration. That's very sensible, but they won't build new council houses. And then you've got Corbyn suggesting he needs to build some council houses. We agree with him. We do. but he's a proponent of open borders virtually. So that's a
nobody's matched supply and demand. Well, Kristian thinks he has by letting the market rip on this. William and Kristian, stay with us. I want to introduce two more guests to get their view on whether the revolution is coming. But William and Kristian, stay with us. A very warm welcome to the show to Tom Slater, Deputy Editor of Spiked, and also a very warm welcome to Patrick Christys, presenter at talkRadio. Tom, a very good evening to you. How are you keeping, sir?
Very well, thanks, Mark. How are you?
And Patrick, great to have you with us. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. It's my first time, so thanks for having me.
Well, yeah, welcome. Your debut. Patrick, let me start with you. Do you get the sense from talkRadio listeners that we're on the verge of a socialist revolution in Britain?
I think not. Certainly not with talkRadio listeners personally. If anything, they will be fighting that revolution quite viscerally. But yes, I do think that fundamentally there is the potential for some kind of socialist revolution. I don't think it'll actually come to anything because I don't think socialists tend to be very good at fighting. But yes, there is a lot of, I think, indoctrination taking place in our schools initially. I think a lot of kids are initially indoctrinated with stuff about hungry kids and NHS cuts and education cuts, of course, by teachers who are all themselves in a union that is inherently very, very left wing. And so that feeds through to society. And then I think what they're not told, though, on top of that, is that they end up having to pay for this. And that's where I suspect that the socialist revolution might end, when they open their wallets and realise that they're going to be the ones to actually have to pay for it. One of the main reasons why I don't think that we're going to have a socialist revolution is because I'm not actually sure how many people are socialists. I know that people are asked about it, and I think it's a very worthy study that's just been done by the IEA. I'm just not sure how true it is in some senses in terms of whether or not people find it easier to say they're a socialist because they find it very difficult to say that actually they might be a bit of a Tory. And so I think you're always going to get one of those issues because they had a chance, didn't they, at the last general election, and indeed the general election before that, to actually vote for genuine socialism, and they've not done it. And we have to question why that is.
Ron, what's your take of this research, that it's actually not football fever that's sweeping the nation, but a yearning to become more and more like North Korea? Is that your reading of the pulse of the nation?
It isn't, and I think you've already touched on this, but it's interesting how what Kristian has found is that the kind of commitment is very wide but quite shallow, giving these statements to young people and then agreeing overwhelmingly with socialist statements, as it were, but they're still being kind of net agreement with capitalist statements. I think there is an element which we've already touched on here, which is that socialism has just become a sort of buzzword. It's kind of like another identity amongst all the other identities. I don't mean to be reductive, but I kind of am being reductive insofar as it is just associated with being a nice person at this point in so many ways, shape or forms. Therefore, I think the kind of argument as to what society these people actually want is very important. But again, you do have to look at some of the fundamentals here, the points about the housing market, which have always been very well made, people feeling like they don't have a stake. And even in previous generations, where in some of the former industrial heartlands that you were talking about there, the kind of sense that, you might not go on and make a huge deal of yourself in life, but you could look forward to a good, steady, well-paid job. All of that eking away, I think, means that this kind of phenomenon isn't just limited to the kind of trustafarian wannabe revolutionaries that Kristian spends all his day arguing with on Twitter, but there's also this kind of broader element of dissatisfaction. How to win the argument, I think, is an interesting one. I'm not a free marketeer, so I haven't really got a dog in that race, but I think that's one of the fundamentally tricky things, is the fact that there is this disillusionment met with the fact that there is this large social cachet, even if it is for an identity which is a little bit on the thin side, shall we say.
I want to bring Kristian and William back in. Kristian, let me start with you. I think the survey also showed that 75% believe that socialism would work, but has never been properly tried. This actually goes back a bit to your book from a couple of years ago, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. Socialism apparently has never been tried, but capitalism has. I mean, presumably from the IA perspective, we want 75% of people to say that free market liberalism would work, but has never been properly tried. What's your analysis, Kristian, on this sort of the idea that there's always sort of another attempt at socialism? We don't, and I think I'm right in saying the survey suggested virtually nobody equated state socialism with Venezuela. So socialism is this vague, amorphous, utopian society. It's not actually what happened in the Soviet Union or what happened in Venezuela. What's your take on that, Kristian?
Yes, that's exactly right. Socialism is absolutely not associated with any real-world socialist experiment. And that is the problem that we have, that socialism is only ever judged as an abstract ideal. And respondents seem to be vaguely aware that there have been places that called themselves socialist, but quickly brushed that aside and say, yeah, well, talk is cheap. They didn't mean it. That wasn't really socialism. And that's why if we want to counter this this antipathy to the market, we have to tackle that perception head on as well. We have to point out, we have to make not just a positive case for the market and for explaining how the market can provide cheap housing and all that, important though that is, but we also have to address this idea that socialism could be fundamentally different from what we've seen so far, from the Venezuela examples and so forth, because there the proponents of socialism always very forgetful and forget about their own involvement and their own former praise for those regimes. Venezuela is the best example. A couple of years ago, there were lots of people on the British left who were praising Venezuela very actively and who now want to forget about that. So the point here that we have to make as, well, not just we as free marketeers, but I think even the Social Democrats and centrists or anyone who is broadly in favor of a market economy, we have to remind people that even projects like in Venezuela did start with good intentions. The Chavistas did not come to power saying we want to create shortages and we want to create a humanitarian crisis and we want to repress political opponents. That was not the intention. It started very much with the same fluffy rhetoric that we hear from the likes of Novara Media today, and look at how it ended. It was not a lack of goodwill.
William, let me come back to you for your thoughts. There's the old adage that the devil has the best tunes. We at the IEA, we're a think tank. We're not involved at all in the kind of electoral or political process. But how much of this do you think comes down to the content of an argument, which the IEA would obsess with? And how much does it come down to the presentation of an argument? This research also found that people associated socialism with, fairness, equality, good treatment, workers' rights, and presumably associate capitalism with corruption, exploitation, businesses ripping off customers and workers. Is it a question so much of the fundamentals of the argument, which on a show like this we'll engage with, or is it in people's minds much, much more presentational, what words you use, and making sure you stay on script, and focus grouping, whether to use fairness and equality as your key buzzwords?
No, I think you're right to make that point, because I think a lot of it's very, very superficial, the way we use these terms. And as I said before, it's probably partly a crisis of education. I think the actual term used in the survey is, that if only socialism was properly executed, and I would argue executed might be the word that you'd want to use. So you need to remind people that when we're talking about state socialism and the experiments in the Soviet Union and so on, we're talking about a totalitarian system which denied people rights. Now, for some reason, because the aim of equality is judged a noble one, that's sort of brushed aside. And I think people need to get real about what it actually entails. Another thing that I would bring up, though, I think there has been a sort of a loss of confidence in a lot of what I would describe as the foundations of our system. So people can have a pop at capitalism, but capitalism, the market in its right place, is necessary. But look at Cambridge University's study in democracy last year that was published, and look at the generational gap in respect for democracy. And unfortunately, young people are quite dismissive of basic. Some young people are dismissive of basic democratic norms to a greater extent than, say, the older generation that actually fought real totalitarians to try and secure it. So I agree. A lot of it's very superficial. I think to go back to the start, the mentioning woke at the start is the biggest confounder at all, because one of the biggest menaces we've got at the moment is woke capitalism.
Patrick, let me bring you back in. IEA spokesmen and women are very often on talkRadio, giving our views about the world, but give it to me straight, Patrick. Is there a danger that folk on the IEA side of the argument come equipped as kind of Dr. Logic, Mr. or Mrs. Rational, We've got a bar graph that proves that a rising tide raises all ships. And, here's a line graph that shows empirically over 40 years that capitalism increases GDP, whereas those on the socialist side of the argument come at it much more perhaps emotionally, a heart argument rather than a head argument. Look at the poor, something must be done. It's terrible that people in this area are suffering, something must be done. Give it to me straight, Patrick. Is that a problem with the way IEA and other free marketeers put their case?
I think the day that irrational emotion wins the day over, empirical fact and something that's been well reasoned and studied, then we're bang in trouble, okay? And I hope that we're nowhere near that yet. I do think that more emotive language does or can indeed win the day. Slogans can win the day, of course. And it's also the psyche. I think someone alluded to it earlier about the thing, might be you actually, alluded to socialism is equated to things like freedom and these very virtuous things, in the same way that Brexit was associated wrongly with racism, for example, and these mottos stick. But if you flip it on its head as well, you look at something like the Black Lives Matter organization. The Black Lives Matter organization, that's associated obviously with fighting racism and anti-racism. What they're trying to move away from is the idea that it might be associated with Marxism, which is basically what their manifesto kind of says that it is. And so actually now in this day and age, don't underestimate the importance of slogans. Of course, again, Donald Trump found out, didn't he, that essentially largely baseless slogans, sometimes like lock her up, can actually win the day. So don't underestimate that. But what I will say is that fact and figure is absolutely massive as well. I think there are some facts and figures, however, that the socialists or that side of the argument can use, and they've been mentioned again, things like home ownership in younger people. You do have to dangle the carrot in front of a lot of people's eyes, don't get me wrong. But I would just make the point, just moving on slightly from that, which is that I do think that what this study shows for me is a reaction more, a general malaise and a general depression, especially amongst younger people, to the world around them. They are an Instagram generation where they see people like Kim Kardashian having it large on a yacht. That doesn't really exist for most people, but they're beamed into their households every single day of the week. And then they turn their phone off and they're in Leicestershire and they think this is naff, I need to smash the system. And so that's why I think actually a lot of younger people are kind of almost getting their politics from. Just lastly, I would say as well, I think fundamentally, and this is why the socialist side of things I don't think will ever win, because I think socialism fundamentally goes against human nature. The idea that there could be no real sense of drastic personal gain or personal profit or personal ambition, I would argue, in the face of full frontal equality, I don't really think that's in us. And the reason why it's not in us is because every time it's had the chance to be tried, it's not worked that way. You have a lot of dictators, socialist dictators with 15 Lamborghinis on the driveway while their population is fighting each other for what scraps of food are left. And that's human nature.
Tom, let me bring you back in. How much do you guys at Spike spend on trying to make sure you've got your arguments right? That's the major focus of our work at the IEA, and I think all people who want to be taken seriously. But how much effort and time do you spend and do you think needs to be spent on kind of framing your argument, not just being right, but thinking how you're going to put your case to resonate with the audience you're speaking to?
I think framing the argument is really important. I think often we see our job at Spikes is to try and point out what's important, what's the bigger issue here. And in that sense, I think some of the arguments we've been hearing so far, again, I think the kind of, for instance, on the free marketeer side and your use guys side of the argument, the recourse to just talking about, say, North Korea or talking about Venezuela, these kinds of very particular authoritarian, North Korea's case, bizarre kind of kingly hermit kingdom and this petrostate in South America as a kind of be all and end all argument is obviously not going to wash. First of all, because, even if Britain did go in a very radical different direction, it wouldn't look like that necessarily. But I think it also just fails to really get to grips with the main argument. I mean, the thing that I find quite striking is, with the exception of the IEA and a few of the other free market think tanks, is that there's not a lot of pro-capitalist people about these days. Even capitalists aren't particularly pro-capitalist. You see this with woke capitalism. You see this with kind of earlier iterations of stakeholder capitalism, their embrace of green politics, etc. They struggle to justify themselves in terms of the corporations and the individuals who make money. Just the suggesting that they're there to make money and to make profits and to deliver for their shareholders, they feel is insufficient. So on your side of the argument, if you like, aside from your own doughty efforts, I think there is a bit of a crisis, if you like, amongst the sort of capitalist set who struggle to justify themselves in their own terms. That's why they have to reach for Black Lives Matter or Greta Thunberg or whatever in order to stress to everyone else that they're not just evil bastards and that they have something to contribute. I think that's a big part of this discussion as well.
Let me get some closing thoughts from Kristian and William and Tom and Patrick. Stay with us. Kristian, what's the strategic playbook lesson from this research? You and I spend an awful lot of time trying to frame and put free market arguments. What's going wrong for us? Why haven't we got 75% of young people saying that Niemietz style liberal utopia would work, but it hasn't been tried yet? What do we need to do in our, not just our arguments, it may be topic selection, but our tone of voice or whatever it might be, in order to make sure the next time we do this polling that numbers are more sympathetic in our favour?
There's just not enough of us around. I think we're doing a pretty good job as far as it goes. And I think you can also combine the dry empirical argument with some more tangible stories, especially if we talk about issues like house prices, housing costs. This is something that you can also relate to what this means in practice, or poverty reduction there. First of all, things like, if you look at the reduction of absolute poverty globally over the past 20, 30, 40 years, it's quite colossal. And there even a graph can be quite powerful. If you say, well, when I was born, a third of the world's population lived in absolute poverty. Now it's 1/10. Okay, yeah, that's an empirical argument, but that is also something that can be quite powerful, especially if you can also point out what that means in practice, that this does make the difference between starving or having an acceptable minimum standard, at least, of living. And I think in that regard, we are on the right track, but there aren't that many of us.
And Kristian, I need to get your optimism number. I've brought back the Live with Littlewood optimism barometer, highly market sensitive. How optimistic are you feeling about the next 5 years or so in the United Kingdom, where from your perspective, our perspective, 10 is free market liberalism has been achieved, 0 is that we do actually end up like North Korea or Venezuela. I should add, we're recording this show shortly before England-Denmark kicks off, but Kristian irritatingly has no interest in football whatsoever. So it's been impossible to wind him up about England beating Germany 2-0. So I know your number will be wholly unaffected by what's happened in Euro 2020, Kristian, but how optimistic are you feeling on a scale of 0 to 10?
My completely unbiased number would be 4. I mean, the poll doesn't make for optimistic reading. The report doesn't make me more optimistic. But again, as I've said, and as all the panelists have said, there is this commitment to socialism, but it is quite superficial. So therefore, we're not going to get a socialist revolution anytime soon with that kind of commitment. I mean, it's not like the Bolsheviks. This might never go very far. It's just that the reason why I wouldn't go above 5 certainly, is that yes, it might be a shallow commitment, but it is nonetheless there. And if we want to see further reforms into a pro-market direction, you also need a bit of enthusiasm for it. It's not enough to say, okay, we have a lot of people are sort of anti-capitalist, but they don't feel strongly about it, so therefore let's not worry about it, because that would be more or less the argument that supporters of Britain's EU membership would have made before the referendum. They would have said, yes, okay, there isn't, most people are somewhat Eurosceptic, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. They don't feel strongly about it. They're not going to do anything about it. So let's forget it, and look how that turned out.
Kristian, always great pleasure to have you with us on Live with Littlewood. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the evening. I bet he's not even going to bother to watch the football, but William, let me come to you. I understand you're a supporter of Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. I don't want that to dampen your optimism in any way whatsoever, but I know you're also approach things from a very different ideological angle to the IEA as a social democrat. So within your own terms, how optimistic are you feeling about the UK over the next 5 years on a scale of 0 to 10? And it must be an integer as well. People often give me 3 numbers or a decimal point, but my maths don't stretch to that. How optimistic are you feeling?
As you know, the SDP is strongly pro-Brexit, and I think actually, I think that aligned with the ability to get our own policy on various trade matters and so on. I'm quite optimistic. I think probably I would say 6 out of 10.
6 out of 10. You've rounded up Kristian's rather negative, below average number. William, absolute pleasure to have you with us again. Thanks so much, sir. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Patrick and Tom, stay with us, but we're now going to move on to our second topic today. I'm delighted also to be joined by another member of the home team, IEA fellow and editor of a recent IEA book, Professor Len Shackleton, and by journalist Jan Macvarish, education and events director at the Free Speech Union. Jan, wonderful to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Good evening. And I hope Len is with us too. Len has recently edited this new IEA publication, Having Your Say, Threats to Free Speech in the 21st Century. Len, great to have you with us. Thanks very much for joining us. Len, let me start with you. This is a topic that free speech, wokery, cancel culture, what really are the restrictions, how much should we worry about it, and all of the rest. We're calling this section Our Lips Are Sealed. We've already covered that young people seem to favour a sort of socialist economic system, at least on the surface of it. Question how deep that is. But a lot of them seem to be more worried about trigger warnings, safe spaces, hate speech, microaggressions, and all of the rest. This isn't really an economics text, but of course the IEA is interested in the fundamental institutions of a free society. What have you, as the editor of this great tome and the authors and contributors to it, give me a short summation of what you've discovered, concluded, and recommend.
Well, Mark, I think free speech is actually a vital underpinning to free markets, and I don't think you should separate the two of them. I mean, I talked on here the other week about advertising, which is one of the chapters in the book. But you know, there's a lot of superficial talk about cancel culture and all this kind of stuff, but I do think it is a serious issue. What we're trying to do in this book is look at it in a serious way from a number of different angles. You know, we've looked at the what's happening in universities, we've looked at what's happening in trade unions, what's happening to religious people. We've also got a few laughs, terrific chapter from Leo Kurz, who I hope we're going to have on here sometime soon, who's a comedian, and the way in which comedy is being cancelled right, left and centre. I think this is a big issue, and you know, we ought to take it seriously. It's paradoxical, isn't it, that we've never had more opportunities to talk to each other, to communicate via social media, by YouTube, by Zoom, all this kind of stuff, and yet there's a lot of people who just want to close it down. My view is that we should all be speaking to each other, and lots of rude arguments and shouting at people and so forth, but for heaven's sake, let's talk. Let's not just close people down.
Jan, let me bring you in. The Free Speech Union has got to establish to lead the fight back, right? That as Len says, so many things now at our fingertips that enables people to communicate, share ideas, and all of the rest of it. 10 years ago, there's no way the IEA could put together a show like this. Now we can, to anybody keen to listen to it or watch it. What's the state of freedom of speech in Britain, Jan? And tell me about the fight back. What is there here to really be worried about?
Well, I think it's happening on so many different levels, isn't it? It's coming from lots of different directions. And it's a combination, I think, in lots of different areas of life where there's on the one hand, a sort of bureaucratic lack of appreciation for freedom of speech, and a kind of a complete blindness to the necessity of free speech to a society that can function as a democratic society, but also as something that's of value to us as human beings at a really fundamental level, and that it's a huge gain for humanity that we've come to understand that everybody should have the right to free thinking and freedom of speech. And so on the one hand, there's this very dry, regulatory, kind of bureaucratic undermining of that. But on the other hand, there's this activism, this kind of mindless activism, which is sort of wrong foots people, I think. And I suppose it relates to what people were saying earlier about young people, where there has been a sort of bowing down to claims of harm, claims that of what looks like idealism, of a desire to move to a better society, that actually are very much based on harm claims. And the problem with harm claims is that they've now become sort of all-encompassing and something that undermine all of our freedoms in so many different kinds of ways. So I think we are in a really serious state. When it comes to the pushback, I mean, in a way, I've never been so optimistic because I think the struggle is more explicit than it's ever been in my lifetime. And you know, if I were ever to be involved in politics, this is what I'd want to be involved in around. And so, you know, making the argument for freedom, I think, is just so important, and it has become a very explicit struggle, and it's something that's where people are coming to realise that this is really fundamental. And so in some ways there's lots of grounds for optimism, because I think that can go to some really brilliant places, even though I think the threat is very, very serious.
Patrick, let me come back to you. Look, in some ways you and Talk Radio are the epitome of kind of freedom of speech working, right? Hugely successful radio station, takes, you know, perhaps a slightly different angle, it has a slightly different style to other radio stations. You might look at Talk Radio. GB News is now available on the diversity of voices, the range of voices is more than ever before. I remember when I was a boy, only 3 TV channels, and virtually every radio station that covered politics, current affairs, or economics was in the hands of the BBC. Is there anything to worry about here, or have we actually got more diversity than ever before? Or do you think there really is this insidious undermining of freedom of speech culturally and bureaucratically?
I think both of those things can exist at the same time. Yes, we do have more outlets than ever before. We do have more things like this kind of thing that you're doing tonight, and these things exist right across the world. However, at the same time, I think if you just look at the way that free speech has gone, from my take on it, it used to not be able to maybe say things under your breath at the pub like, "Oh, actually, I support Brexit." Now you might get attacked in the street by Antifa in some places in America. The Trump rally in the UK that I went to report on as a journalist, if you were walking around there with a Trump hat on, you were getting beaten up. Now that's obviously not exactly a great expression of free speech. I think a lot of young people especially don't quite get free speech, or the fact that it needs to be protected, because a lot of them haven't necessarily fought or died to protect it. There's a few ways in which I think that the free speech is massively under threat. So social media, right? Because who sets the rules to what you can and can't say on social media? Also, the fact that people now increasingly are dragging up old jokes or old statements or old videos that come from people, from years ago. And it's not just the fact that social media warriors now are saying things like, "Oh, this is awful." They'll also contact your boss, try to get you sacked, ring the police, and go back through your own personal records in order to actually systematically ruin you and make sure that you never work again. Yes, we've got things like trigger warnings, as people have said on old episodes of Faulty Towers. But again, the freedom of speech here, that's now leading to one established and an accepted style of humor. If you go to comedy clubs now, okay, you can't even make jokes about people who are obese, for example, because a lot of the time people find that too offensive. And I say that as someone who myself used to get weighed at the zoo. So please don't take offense to that, anybody. From a commercial sense, you mentioned there as well, that actually, if you look at GB News, people were trying to cancel GB News before it even came into existence. And Ofcom have come out and said there's nothing wrong with it. And there isn't anything wrong with it. There is balance there, but people are still trying to get their advertisers to ditch it. When you look at players taking the knee at the Euros, can they actually speak out if they don't want to? Harry Maguire was the only player that didn't take the knee for the England team during the last match at Ukraine. Now, actually, the England team have been quite quiet about that. Now, I think free speech there is clearly being suppressed. But just lastly, if I may, I think what I'm really concerned about when it comes to free speech in this country is the suspension of reality about certain factors, okay? We have seen recently, haven't we, at a primary school in Birmingham, for example, where the head teacher tried to just put LGBT stuff on the curriculum. Not on the curriculum, but just to try to teach children not to be mean to people of the LGBT community, don't bully them. And we ended up there with about 300 parents outside that school. Now, the vast majority of them were of the Muslim community. In fact, all of them really were of the Muslim community, basically coming out against it, saying that things like gay people will burn in hellfire. Well, are we allowed in a free country to suggest that maybe that implies that there might be an issue within a certain community when it comes to things like LGBT rights? Well, you can't really say that, because then supposedly now you're racist. Well, that's a massive curtailment on free speech, and that's backed up right to the top of certain political parties in this country. And that's a concern for me.
Dom, you guys at Spike, this is one of your key core issues. Explain to me what the nub of it is. I mean, we at the IEA tend to look at this through, what are the rules and the regulations, and we have some very interesting internal discussions about, property rights versus freedom of speech. A social media platform is a private enterprise, I guess. If Twitter don't want Republicans on it. I know they haven't gone that far, but sort of a matter to them. Here at the IEA, the events we hold have a disproportionate number of people who are sympathetic to free market liberalism. We don't sort of ban socialists, but they certainly don't get as big a platform at the IEA. And we'd say that's a private property rights issue. But somehow or other, I feel you're going to tell me, Tom, that doesn't really get to the nub of the issue. What is the problem here on the tightness on what you can say? You got to kind of, we're all destined to become diplomats. And if I remember, the definition of a diplomat is somebody who thinks twice before saying nothing.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, what you see, I think, is kind of three main fronts in this fight. First of all, there's obviously state censorship, something I'm sure you've talked about a lot of the times on the show, the way in which we see more and more encroachments in free speech in relation to hate speech and hate crime law. You've got this kind of corporate censorship in the form of social media firms who are obviously wielding enormous power with zero accountability, which I know makes libertarians squeamish, but is a serious thing on people's ability to exercise freedom of speech. And then, of course, there's the sort of mob censorship online and off, the cancellation campaigns, just that sheer intolerance, which you see manifest in the trans skeptical feminist discussion through to the Mohammed cartoons discussion that we've seen play out recently. It's all kind of part of that mixture. But I think coming back to a point that Jan made, the thing that connects all of this is that there's not a culture which sort of affirms free speech, which sees it as an important value. And that therefore that kind of slops across all of our different discussions. And I think that's the thing which really needs to be grappled with. And as Jan was saying, I think there's a lot to be positive about in how bad things have got, because it's forced the issue. It's created new alliances, which I never thought I would see. I mean, all of the kind of gender critical feminists are suddenly Spike's best friends, despite the fact they were running around 10 years ago trying to get misogyny to become a hate crime and hate speech and all the rest of it. A lot of people are kind of being mugged by the reality of that old argument of freedom of speech, which is that if you allow it to take place, if you allow it to be, if you allow your opponents to be censored, you do create a standard which will eventually be used against you. And that, I think, is creating a very useful pushback. And I think what's been great about groups like the Free Speech Union in particular has been the fact that recognizing that you can't just fight this on a kind of technical legal front, that you have to take cancel culture on, and that you have to take up the arguments, because it's not a technical, legal, even issue of big business that we're dealing with here. It's a broader crisis of those views amongst the establishment, but now, thankfully, a kind of nascent kickback amongst everyone else, it feels like.
Len, let me come back to you. How should people of a kind of IEA state of mind, who, tend to look at the rules and is this public sector or private sector, deal with this cultural phenomenon? I mean, for example, do you distinguish between state censorship and regulators being overzealous or police investigating non-crime hate incidents? What should a free market, liberal-minded person make of, say, the social media platforms, which a number of our guests have now raised? Or do we just say, well, Twitter's a private company, what they ban and what they allow is entirely a matter for them, and if they ban too many people, other things will pop up?
Well, ultimately, the state is more of a worry because they can lock you up and so on. But there is this thing about, virtually every establishment that you look at, whether it's a charity, it's a university, it's the civil service, it's the National Trust or whatever, all seem to be infected by this state of mind. And, when I was young, and I'm very old, there were student revolutionaries, there was the LSE, the gates were torn down, there was fighting in the streets, there were all sorts of things going on. But there was actually a fight back against this from the establishment, and people were sent to jail. I had a mate who went to prison after a demonstration in Cambridge, who came out of prison 6 months later. His hair had gone white. This is something which was a real thing. But now you are faced with organizations which appear to be made out of jelly. And anybody who says anything about, this is offensive or something, immediately the organization caves in. And as somebody mentioned before, woke capitalism. I mean, that's also a thing. So I think both of these things, what the government is doing and what civil society is doing, are presenting us with lots of worries.
Dan, let me come back to you. Do you think sort of in the long run, this all corrects itself? I know Keynes, the great economist, said, in the long run, we're all dead. So often long run answers aren't necessarily ones that you'd immediately embrace. But might you get into a situation where it turns out that that virtually every decent cricketer in England has made some sort of slightly off-colour joke on Twitter 10 years previously. So lo and behold, we're going to have to accept that if we want a half-decent cricket team. Or, a good number of academics have made a remark here or there, and if universities sack them, which are the sort of things that you guys at the Free Speech Union campaign against, more power to you. But that sooner or later there'll be a corrective mechanism here. The cricket board and universities will have to say, actually, we want academics who can tell a good joke, and we don't mind if somebody who scores runs for England made an off-colour remark on Twitter. Will it correct itself, or is that just sort of leaving it too long run, too much to chance, and we might have actually descended into an unbelievably censorious, uniform society by then?
I don't think it will correct itself by itself. I think it has to have a pushback, because the problem is, bureaucrats have got no interest in freedom. So if these kinds of much of what's going on in restricting free speech is coming about through speech codes, there's also a colonisation of law, but these kinds of areas of life are often invisible to us until we hit against them, and often they happen in secret. So students like the student at Abertay University recently we represented, Lisa Keogh, we wouldn't have heard, nobody would know that had gone on, that she had been disciplined or subject to a disciplinary procedure for saying something in a seminar, unless she had known, if she hadn't known somebody at her university who said to her, get in touch with the Free Speech Union. So if we didn't exist and we didn't have a way of finding out about these cases, she would just be another student who'd gone through a disciplinary procedure. And I suspect there are thousands of students over here that's happened to, and we just do not know. So she's the tip of the iceberg, I'm sure. So, and the thing is about it is that she was reported by other students. Now, what that suggests is that if the grown-ups in the room, whether they're 19-year-olds or whether they're 83, we've got to say to young people that you can't see this culture of conformity because you haven't actually been exposed to the alternative ideas. So that's the problem with a culture of conformity, isn't it? It's self-reinforcing. So we have to create an alternative and actually very inspiring climate, which says any idea can be thought and said, and it won't actually hurt you. You will find that it's actually invigorating to encounter an idea that's the opposite of what you currently think. And so I've been working with students and recent graduates over the last 8 months or so on the Free Speech Champions programme that the FSU is supporting along with the Battle of Ideas. And that's been absolutely brilliant, working with people in their early 20s who some of them have been disciplined or have been subject to disciplinary procedures. Other ones have just felt that climate on campus that is the complete antithesis of what they were expecting when they went to university. And they've got and some of them have come through that experience of having a particular set of beliefs that hits directly up against the current buffers, like being a gender critical feminist. And what happens through that process is that they do start to see, well, okay, actually, there has to be a common standard here. There has to be a presumption of freedom of speech for everybody. And that's a really, really positive thing for people to experience, and actually to then build on that and try to radiate that outwards. And it's a very small minority of students at the moment who are actively involved in that kind of pushing back. But I think that they could have an impact because they are far more inspiring than the mindless activism I was talking about earlier, which is essentially doom laden. So, I do think it's a much more positive case that can be put for freedom than can ever be put for something that's restrictive.
Patrick, do you think we need to get away from it? It seems to me we're dangerously close, not really framed in law, but as in culture, that everybody has a right not to be offended. I don't think that this right exists. And I also think that but by some people, it's overused. I mean, I have an incredibly high threshold before I'm offended, as it happens, right? Virtually nothing offends me. I was mortally offended when people in my own office changed my computer login password to the date when Portsmouth won the FA Cup. As a devout Southampton fan, that's probably the most offended I've been in recent years. But do we need to be robust, you as a presenter, all of us involved in public debate, by turning around and just saying, well, I don't really care whether you're offended. I mean, that's not meaningfully injurious. Be offended if you like, but that's not going to stop me saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very niche hack as well, that Mark. I enjoyed that. I thought it was good. No, I do think that there is a real issue about the fact that now, as you've rightly said, people feel as though they've got a right to not be offended. Well, again, I would question who sets those rules. What level of offence are we talking about? One thing that's offensive to one person, another person might find absolutely hilarious. And indeed, that's kind of the way that the world works, right? And so I don't think it's any surprise whatsoever that the word snowflake now is coming to the fore more than ever, and it's because we're actually actively breeding them. It's like, I think we've got kind of a snowflake breeding program going on throughout schools and throughout universities, I think in early year society, where people now cannot walk past a statue of Winston Churchill without wanting to graffiti the living heck out of it. Of course, yes, there were indeed offensive things that happened that Winston Churchill said, and he was a man of his time, and also some of the things he said regarding being a man of his time were just quite offensive, but he did also defeat the Nazis, and that's pretty massive, right? And so if you have to tear that guy's statue down as a result of that, I've got serious reservations about, well, frankly, whether or not you're actually mentally sound. I think this is one of the things that we've got a problem with now, which is that the people are too afraid of being cancelled, right? So universities and lecturers and companies and corporations are so afraid that they might be cancelled for saying the one wrong thing, or even now in this day and age of unconscious bias and stuff like this, where that's impossible to get right. You cannot get that right? You can't. And so they're so afraid of being cancelled that they're now overly sanitizing anything. And the case in point, not to keep dragging it back to social media, but one of them is when all it takes now is for really one individual to contact a company on social media and say, I'm offended by this. And if you throw in the word racism in that as well, or sexism in that as well, quite often they might pull their advertising from something, or they might do something like that. Now, we cannot live in a world where it singularly takes one individual to be offended by something, because what offends you might not offend me, and vice versa. I'm all right with that personally. I think this creates a diverse kind of enrichment of opinion. And also, you know what? Things change over time. Some things that might have offended me when I was 13 or 14 years old don't offend me now. And I think if we cancel everything, then frankly, we're killing society, really. We're over-sanitizing. We do not live in a very sterile environment.
Tom, is this the route we've got to get over any sense culturally that you don't have a right to be offended? I guess legally, this might mean that we have to look long and hard at hate crimes. I've always hated the term. I mean, crime very often involves hate. If you punch somebody in the face, I consider that pretty hateful, irrespective of your motivation, whether you've done it because they're tall, short, black, white, gay, straight, whatever. Is that the bit we've got to get over, that to actually just say, you know, being offended is part of life? Sometimes it's actually, I mean, I actually find the funniest comedy routines, and again, you can read Leo Kearse in this, to actually be quite offensive, but nevertheless funny.
Yeah, 100%. I think we've almost got to do two things at the same time. One of which is that we do have to be more courageous. Censorship is empowered by cowardice, and we see that across the piece. And I think you do have to, at certain points, just point out how pathetic this behaviour is. You know, going to pieces in the face of, it's not even arguments anymore. You know, it's a photo of Prince Philip in a round robin email at King's College London that people are getting completely upset about. But also recognising, I think, that is also insufficient, particularly with the younger generation, because of the fact that they have taken on board this very obnoxious idea that free speech is basically the enemy of minorities. That's basically the crux of so many of these different discussions we have. This idea that you have to patronisingly protect ethnic minorities, gay people, trans people, and this complete ahistorical nonsense, which misses the fact that free speech was always the greatest ally to these groups, that any civil rights, social justice movement worth its salt reached for free speech. It was the only thing they had. So I think alongside having a bit of fun, being a bit courageous, pointing out how ridiculous a lot of this behaviour is, I think that's the nub of the argument, particularly with young people. Somewhere along the line, they've started to consider free speech as basically the enemy of a good and tolerant and inclusive society, bizarrely. And that's the thing that I think we need to get over as well.
Len, do you have a sort of, I mean, I'm not suggesting there's a magic bullet, but it'd be great if you had one. Do you have a kind of public policy solution here? In this book, it's pointed out hate speech provisions have a very long history. They're not a modern thing, and they actually tend to harm disadvantaged communities very often more than they help them. But is there a public policy prescription that you could put forward? I mean, in universities now, there's a suggestion that there'll be sort of state-sanctioned free speech champions. On the one hand, I like champion free speech. On the other hand, I'm not really sure I want Gavin Williamson to appoint lots of sort of free speech. Having a free speech czar is almost a contradiction in terms, right? Decide whether you're a czar or in favour of freedom of speech. But is there some public policy change or alteration or activism or repeal that could help this problem, Len?
Well, I'm with you on hate crime. I can't see that this is a legitimate way to go about things. I mean, wasn't it, I don't know, Elizabeth I who said she didn't want to peer into men's souls? I mean, the idea of the hate crime thing is that a court, a jury can decide what was in somebody's head, and this makes the crime different from if they were thinking something else. I mean, I think that is fundamentally wrong, and we should, that is something which we should repeal, I think. Do we need any institutional backup to this? Well, you're right about free speech czars and so forth. There are far too many people in universities and public institutions doing non-jobs. And I think this is ultimately a non-job. If you've got legal protections, then you don't need these kind of characters. If you've got people who take their responsibilities as university teachers or whatever it may be, properly, you don't need people spying over their shoulders and whatever. So I think we need to get processes right within university, schools, civil service, etc. But I don't think we need particular champions to push this. Civil society can push these things. The Free Speech Union can push this. The IEA can push this. We don't need regulators to do it, I don't think.
Patrick, how much the present regulators are curse for folk in your profession? We still have Ofcom sort of regulating traditional media. Ofcom obviously doesn't regulate what's put out on YouTube, and it's pretty difficult to distinguish between the two. But then YouTube will have lots of rules about what can be said and what can't be said. Would you welcome, Patrick, a kind of activist regulator enforcing freedom of speech and diversity of opinion? I worry about that somewhat.
Yeah, I worry about it. I mean, look, my personal take on it is that if I watch something or listen to something and I don't particularly like it or was offended by it, then I would turn it over. Now, I possibly would say that because I'm in that line of work where I certainly don't want any more regulation than the ones I already have to operate under. However, look, Ofcom has got a relatively strict set of guidelines, you could say. I mean, some of those things are just common sense, by the way, like, don't drop the C-bomb at 9 a.m. in the morning. I mean, do we need someone to tell us that? But apparently you do. However, I must say, the Ofcom have gone into bat for me a couple of times, big time, and they've gone into bat recently for Dan Woodson at GB News. And actually, to be honest with you, I've usually found Ofcom to be pretty fair, really. And in a way, it works because anyone can make a complaint to them. And how often do you end up really always seeing them? Sometimes they get it wrong, but often you always see them go and make an apology. The problem is actually the human beings in the organisations themselves a lot of the time. And I think the Piers Morgan example is the best one of that. Piers didn't say or do anything that was inherently Ofcomable, otherwise Ofcom would have thrown the book at him. But what the problem was that his bosses really said to him, hang on a minute, we suspect that what you just said there was so offensive, whether or not we find it that offensive, that we're going to present you with a choice. You either come on and apologise or you walk. Or if you don't walk, we sack you, right? Well, that's the human beings. That's not the regulation. We certainly don't need any more codified regulation in order to make Piers Morgan walk away from things. So I don't think I'm in favour of that. YouTube is an issue, can be an issue. YouTube does have quite, in my opinion anyway, some form of stricter regulations. I do suspect that we're going to move into a world, however, and I think this could be a concern if we're not already there, where things like voice recognition and things like word recognition software in programs like YouTube or in things like Twitter videos or Facebook videos can shadow ban or will shadow ban or will just delete various things. Now, that's a concern because, again, I suspect that that's a decision that would be made in-house by a lot of those companies behind closed doors.
And that we wouldn't even know what it was.
No, exactly.
Like,
that's the point. And that's the point. And that's got to be a problem. So if we end up living in that world, then I would have to say, all right, we need some more codified regulation, because that's the only answer to the uncodified regulation that we would have. But to be honest with you, I'd just like to live and let live, Mark, really.
Yeah, very wise words indeed. Jan, do you have a kind of prescription? Again, I know that there's probably lots of bronze bullets here rather than one silver bullet, but is there some specific law that you guys would like changed? I've had some very interesting early conversations here with our new head of our Cultural Affairs Unit, Mark Glendenning, who's wondering and exploring whether we could get a kind of First Amendment in Britain. Is there any way you could make freedom of expression, if you like, a superior law above others in the way that it is in the States? Very difficult in the UK's constitutional structure. But do you have something that you guys at FSU are looking to as, if we did this, or we had this particular act of parliament, or this particular new law, or remove those laws, then we'd be in a much better place?
Well, we're doing that kind of campaigning and lobbying on a lot of areas of laws, whether that's hate crime or and hate speech, whether that's the new online safety bill. So there's a lot of sort of separate areas of law where the new presumptions around harm are affecting changes in the law and in danger of really undermining freedom in a very profound and lasting way. So there are a lot of areas that I think, you know, that deserve our attention. I suggest you get my legal colleague, Bryn Harris, back to talk about the specific proposals as to whether there's one thing that could unify everything. But to come back to the campus point, I think if the government's free speech champion, who I would distinguish from my free speech champions, the free speech champions I'm working with, who are, you know, brilliant young people who are very smart and very independent minded and want to say what they want to say. I think if the government were to champion free speech, I don't imagine, well, I'm hoping it won't be a person on every campus with a clipboard. You know, I think that would be counterproductive, going around and sort of measuring the free speech component of any public event or every seminar room. But I do think that we have reached a point where something that reasserts the law itself would be quite healthy, actually, compared to these kinds of codes and kangaroo courts, which is what's going on in a really quite semi-visible way. So if that's what the Office for Student does and sets up, is a kind of somebody who really is expert in the law around free speech and actually can be consulted and pass very quick judgments on breaches of the law and people's individual rights on campus, I don't have a problem with that. I think that could be quite healthy. I think for that to actually happen, I think we have to keep on pushing and make sure that is where this ends up. But I think anything that tips things back towards a presumption in favour of freedom of speech, I think it would probably can be a very positive thing.
Tom, what's your prescription? Is it just as perennially raising this, trying to change the culture? I received an email a few days ago. I won't say who it was from, but had the great quote or the cliche, depending on how you look at it. So, Mark, you know, you've got to remember the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Hadn't even bothered to put the CE on the end of the word vigilance. I think that's how you take. That's how vigilant you're being. You're not the kind of guy I want to go into the jungle with, mate. Can't even be bothered to spell vigilance. But is it a question of just all of us as citizens in whatever line of work we're in, acting in the right appropriate fashion, being, if you like, culturally aware of this, raising these issues in culture, or is there a legal change you'd like to see?
I think it does basically come down to the cultural thing. I mean, there are many legal things that I think we do need to look into. As Jan was saying, clarifying the law about universities' actual responsibilities is very important. Repealing some of the things that we've been talking around malicious communications and people getting banged up for tweeting something, through to the hate speech laws that we have on statute. All of this stuff is really important. But I think America gives us a good guide on how the law is not enough. I mean, I've been very envious at various points of the First Amendment. But at the same time, not only did for the most time that the First Amendment was in existence, it didn't have any teeth. It was only really the 60s and civil rights litigation actually made it as strong as it is today. But also a lot of the problems they're having with campus culture, cancel culture, social media campaigns, all the rest of it, are exactly the same, if anything, far more vociferous than we have over here. And I think part of the problem there was a level of complacency on the part of free speech advocates, if you like, because they always had litigation and the First Amendment to rely on. So yes, it feels like I'm repeating myself, but I think even though there are specific legal things we do have to pursue, it does come down to that cultural argument at the end of the day.
And I need to wrap up by asking all of you how optimistic you're feeling for the highly market sensitive Live with Littlewood barometer. You know, think very long and hard about your number. It could send the stock markets spiraling downwards or zooming in the morning, depending on what you come up with. Tom, how optimistic are you feeling? An integer between 0 and 10. I still haven't worked out whether 0 is an integer or not, but a number without a decimal point between 0 and 10, one number only, where 10 is, you know, freedom and prosperity and a great, you know, society and economy in 5 years' time, and 0 is we have become something like North Korea. Tom, how optimistic are you feeling?
I'm going to say 7, but I think that's a long-term prospect. I think things are going to get worse before they get better on issues of free speech, on the issue of us climbing out of the hole that COVID and lockdown has dug for us. But ultimately, I think we're going to move through all of these things because, yes, I think especially with the climbing out of lockdown aspect, I think there's a lot of pent up energy, which is going to be released, hopefully, to a much more freer society at the end of all of this.
So a 7 because it's a 5-year span, but you're not very optimistic about the next 12 months. Things might get worse first. Patrick, what about you? The first Director General of the IEA, when he was asked in the 1970s, Ralph Harris, God rest his soul, about how everything looked absolutely terrible from a freedom perspective. You know, the state controlled vast swathes of the economy, the trade unions ran everything. And he was told how he ever kept on going. And his response was, cheer up, things can only get worse. By which he meant that things would get to a particular point and then actually there'd be a reaction and we would move forward and liberate, which indeed did happen in the late 1970s and the 1980s. How optimistic are you feeling between now and 2026?
Oh, bold, right. I do think things are going to get worse before they get better, unfortunately. I do think that we're going to end up with more cancellations in friend groups, cancellations at work, and potentially even more of that dreaded regulation that we spoke about, until potentially there is some kind of free speech revolution, which can't come soon enough. I'm going to have to stick with start with a I suppose that makes me a 5, doesn't it? Really? It's going to get worse.
It's so middle of the road at Talk Radio.
Yeah, always sitting on the fence. I've got splinters in my backside. You know me, Mark.
A 5 from Patrick. Jan, let me come to you. How optimistic are you feeling? Freedom, prosperity, and a flourishing society, an almost utopia is a 10. We've lost every single battle is a 0. What's it look like in 2026
Oh my God. Well, it depends on the.
I leave the easiest questions to
depends
last,
on the result in a few hours' time. I mean, that will really affect on it. I mean, I'm a lot more optimistic now that I've left academia than when I was working within it, I have to say. And I find that, you know, my sense of optimism is entirely subjective. It's based on whether I feel like I'm doing something positive that's moving things in the right direction, and I do feel that.
Well, you are. That should be a 10 then.
Well, I know, exactly. Well, 10 then. 11. I'll take it to 11.
I can only really give you a 10. Rules are rules, but I'll let you have a 10. Jan, thanks very much. Len, what about you?
Well, last time you asked me this, I think I gave it a 3. I'm feeling a bit more optimistic, particularly with England in the semi-finals. So I'll push it up to a 4, but no higher, I think.
A 4. Blimey. Well, I guess I'm a bit football biased. I'm going to give a 6. That comes to a total of 42, which you can always see the number I give is at the end is just to make the division easier, right? That's 42 divided by a total of 7, which gives an average of exactly 6. My number's more reflected on my inability to do long division than it is by anything else, but we'll see. Tom, Patrick, Jan, Len, thanks very much for spending your time with us and for your thoughts. Absolutely wonderful to see you. My thanks too to Kristian and William, who joined us earlier on the show. We're still more optimistic than average at 6.0 recurring. Thanks to all of you for watching us. If you've enjoyed the show, please hit the thumbs up on YouTube. And if you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. As you would have seen going across the YouTube screen, if you do have a few pennies spare, especially if you've been backing England to get this far in the tournament, then throw them our way to keep us on air. Unlike the BBC, we can't enforceably charge you. So we are entirely reliant on your voluntary philanthropy. You can go to patreon.com/IEA London to become an IEA Patreon. We'll use all of that money to keep the studio running and to produce more content. My special thanks to those of you who have signed up at the VIP level to support us. Nick Heath, who's done so in the course of this programme, Eric Keane, Richard Leader, Mark Edwards, Timothy Worrell, James Burns. Thanks to all of you. Please join them by going to Patreon and giving us your hard-earned cash as well. Thanks very much for watching. Stay safe, stay free. I don't know if football's coming home, but let's make sure that freedom is. Over and out.